January 16th, 2026. In Aguascalientes, Mexico, the morning heat hangs heavily in the air. There is no chaos, only a thick, humid silence. For almost a decade, one man had managed to move through streets like these without being caught. He lived like a shadow, changing appearances and becoming little more than a name buried inside FBI files. His face had spent years on the 10 most wanted list. To understand why authorities had searched for him so long, I have to take you back to 2016 and the wooded outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina. That was where a young woman lost her life over only a few $100s, after a simple financial dispute turned into something far more serious. The man investigators believe responsible didn't just leave town. He disappeared into another country and seemingly built an entirely different life, but the case never disappeared with him. Nearly 10 years later, in the pale light of an early Mexican morning, steel handcuffs finally closed around the fugitive's wrists. The ghost finally had a name again: Alejandro Rosales Castillo. And after almost a decade, the events of 2016 had finally caught up with him. If you enjoy stories like this, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Every bit of support helps the channel. Thank you. Charlotte, North Carolina is often pictured as a city of glass towers, surrounded by peaceful neighborhoods and old oak trees. It's the kind of place where the American dream can still feel possible for people willing to work for it. In 2016, this city was home to Alejandro Rosales Castillo and Sandy Lay. To people who knew them from a local Showmars restaurant where they both worked, they looked like ordinary young adults trying to handle jobs, money, relationships, and independence. Alejandro had been born in Arizona but spent much of his life around Charlotte. He was 20 years old and known as a capable worker, though people around him noticed that he seemed determined to live beyond what his paycheck could support. He carried himself with confidence and liked projecting success. What may have seemed like simple arrogance at the time would later look much more troubling to investigators. Sandy, 23, was very different. Her family described her as kind, hardworking, dependable, and always willing to help others. She was gentle but intelligent, organized, and serious about building a better future. The restaurant wasn't just another paycheck for Sandy. She was working towards stability and something bigger for herself. She was also generous. If someone she cared about was struggling financially, Sandy often tried to help. Unfortunately, that willingness to trust people would eventually place her in a dangerous situation. Like many restaurants, Showmars had a close social circle among employees. Long shifts and stressful nights created friendships that continued outside work. One person inside that circle was Amia Feaster, known as Abby, who would later become important to the investigation. Abby was 19 and closely involved with Alejandro. Their relationship was unstable and both seemed drawn to a lifestyle they couldn't really afford. From the outside, they looked like another young couple trying to make things work. Behind closed doors, however, Alejandro appeared to hold most of the control. The problem that changed everything began with something ordinary: money. Alejandro had borrowed about $1,000 from Sandy. That might not sound enormous, but for young people living paycheck to paycheck, it could represent weeks of work and a meaningful amount of savings. For Sandy, it was money she had earned. For Alejandro, the unpaid loan seemed to become a growing source of resentment. Instead of seeing Sandy's help as generosity, he appeared to view the debt as something hanging over him. Every reminder to repay it became another obligation he didn't want. By the summer of 2016, his frustration with Sandy was becoming harder to ignore. He reportedly began talking with Abby about their money problems. Slowly, Sandy was no longer described as the friend who had helped him, but as someone pressuring them for repayment. That change was important because it allowed Alejandro to turn a normal request for money into something he could blame Sandy for. And according to what investigators later uncovered, he wasn't simply looking for another excuse to delay repayment. He was beginning to think about removing both the debt and the person connected to it. Sandy had no idea how far his resentment had gone. She continued going to work, showing up for her shifts with the same familiar smile people at the restaurant knew well. Sandy always tried to see the good in people. She believed Alejandro would repay the loan once he got back on his feet, never realizing that every time she asked about the money, his resentment toward her seemed to grow. Alejandro's story wasn't about a man suddenly pushed over the edge by one terrible event. It was about someone who repeatedly chose the easiest path for himself, even when another person had to pay the price. His earlier life around Charlotte showed signs of that pattern. There had been minor trouble with the law, a habit of disappearing when problems became serious, and a tendency to rely on women to help support the lifestyle he wanted. By August of 2016, everything had reached a dangerous point. Alejandro was struggling financially, deeply frustrated, and beside him was Abby, someone devoted enough to follow his lead. Away from Charlotte's towers and busy streets, the wooded areas of North Carolina were about to become the setting where the ordinary image Alejandro presented to the world would finally fall apart. Sandy wasn't simply caught up in a robbery. Investigators would later come to believe that Alejandro had decided his pride and freedom mattered more than her safety. That was the atmosphere surrounding the case in 2016. A small debt, growing resentment, and careful manipulation were slowly building toward a crime that would remain unresolved for nearly 10 years. A busy restaurant like Shomar's creates its own little world. Employees spend long hours together in tight spaces, deal with stressful lunch rushes, and finish exhausting closing shifts side by side. For Sandy, the restaurant wasn't only a job, it was a community, and she was one of those people who helped keep that community steady. Among the younger employees were Alejandro Castillo and Amia Abby Feaster. At first, the three of them seemed like ordinary coworkers who had become friends after spending so much time together. They ate together, complained about difficult customers, and shared stories from their personal lives. Eventually, the relationship moved beyond work, and Sandy began treating Alejandro almost like a younger friend she wanted to help. She saw a 20-year-old who seemed to be struggling to get his life together. So when Alejandro talked about his financial problems, Sandy offered him help. The roughly $1,000 loan was meant to be temporary. Sandy saw it as a way to help a friend through a difficult period, believing Alejandro would eventually return the money. But once the money changed hands, the relationship began to shift. Instead of feeling grateful, Alejandro appeared to grow increasingly uncomfortable with the obligation. In his mind, Sandy gradually stopped being the person who had helped him. She became a reminder that he owed money he either couldn't or didn't want to repay. Even her simple questions about when he might return it began to bother him. What Sandy probably saw as reasonable check-ins, Alejandro seemed to interpret as pressure. At the same time, his relationship with Abby was becoming more intense. Abby was deeply attached to Alejandro and appeared drawn to his confidence and the excitement he brought into her life. She was still young and increasingly influenced by his version of events. In private, Alejandro began describing Sandy not as a friend, but as someone causing problems for them. He told Abby that Sandy was pressuring them over the debt and making their lives more difficult. Slowly, he turned Abby's loyalty toward him into resentment toward Sandy. The manipulation was subtle. Alejandro wasn't simply presenting a criminal plan. He was convincing Abby that Sandy was a problem affecting both of them and that something had to be done. As the summer moved forward, all three continued working around one another, but their relationships had changed beneath the surface. Sandy remained friendly, dependable, and professional. She had no idea that Alejandro and Abby were discussing her privately, or that the money she had loaned had become the center of something much darker. To most of the employees at Shomar's, nothing looked especially unusual. They simply saw coworkers who sometimes spent time together outside the restaurant. What they couldn't see was how much influence Alejandro had gained over Abby. He was using her devotion to push a plan that was becoming more serious. His manipulation became increasingly deliberate. He didn't just tell Abby that Sandy was causing trouble. He made Abby feel as though solving the situation was partly her responsibility. Alejandro played on her fear of losing him, suggesting that the debt could keep them from building a future together. He also began talking about leaving Charlotte and starting over somewhere else, possibly in Mexico, where he had family connections. But if Alejandro and Abby wanted to leave Charlotte and start over somewhere else, they needed money, and they needed to remove anything they believed was holding them back. Before long, Sandy became the center of that problem. Alejandro convinced Abby that they were somehow the victims in the situation. He framed the pressure over the unpaid loan as something being done to them rather than the result of a debt he had willingly taken on. The two of them began feeding into each other's worst thinking. Alejandro pushed the direction of the plan while Abby gave him the loyalty and validation he needed to keep moving forward. Eventually, they started discussing how they would leave Charlotte behind. At the center of that plan was one final meeting with Sandy. Alejandro knew her habits and understood how she thought. More importantly, he knew she trusted him and would probably believe him if he said he was finally ready to make things right. He didn't need to force Sandy into a dangerous situation. All he had to do was give her a believable reason to meet him, so he told her exactly what she had been waiting to hear. He claimed he finally had the money and was ready to repay the loan. For Sandy, that probably sounded like a huge relief. After months of waiting and repeated promises, she could finally close the chapter and move on without any more uncomfortable conversations about money. Meanwhile, Alejandro and Abby had to keep acting completely normal. Every conversation, every look, and every interaction had to seem ordinary enough that Sandy wouldn't notice anything strange. By this point, however, their relationship with her was no longer what it appeared to be. The meeting they were arranging wasn't really about money anymore. It had become part of a larger plan to leave Charlotte and escape the problems Alejandro believed were closing in around him. For Alejandro, it would also mark the moment when he stopped being a young restaurant worker struggling with money and became a fugitive whose name would later appear on one of the FBI's most recognizable lists. The saddest part was that Sandy never seemed to recognize the danger behind someone she considered a friend. She judged Alejandro through her own values of loyalty, honesty, and basic decency, not realizing that he was operating by a very different set of rules. While Sandy was thinking about her future, Alejandro was focused on removing what he considered an obstacle. To her, the debt was simple. She had helped someone during a difficult time, and eventually she expected that person to return what he owed. To Alejandro, that same debt had become something much larger. It represented pressure, responsibility, and an obligation he clearly didn't want to face. That is part of what makes this case so disturbing. It wasn't caused by one sudden argument or a single emotional explosion. It appears to have developed slowly during ordinary workdays, casual conversations, and routine shifts, while everyone around them continued believing that nothing unusual was happening. The friendship had started with trust and a loan. Now it was heading toward a quiet, isolated location where that trust would be completely betrayed, and the motive itself was painfully simple. Alejandro didn't need some deep personal hatred towards Sandy. Investigators believed he saw her as someone standing between him and the life he wanted. Over time, he apparently convinced himself, and then Abby, that removing that obstacle was the easiest way out of the situation. By August of 2016, the planning stage was almost over. The debt was about to be settled, but not in any way Sandy could have imagined. Everything had been arranged, and Sandy still believed she was simply going to meet a coworker who was finally keeping his promise. On Tuesday, August 9th, 2016, the heavy North Carolina summer heat hung over Charlotte as Sandy prepared for what she believed would be a straightforward meeting. After months of waiting, Alejandro had finally contacted her with good news. He said he had the money. According to the plan, he wanted to meet later that evening and repay what he owed. He didn't suggest doing it at the restaurant or somewhere crowded, instead presenting the meeting as a private way to finally end the tension between them. Sandy agreed. She had worked beside Alejandro, talked with him, laughed with him, and considered him part of the same close circle of coworkers. Nothing in her experience with him seemed serious enough to make her believe she was walking into danger. As evening approached, Sandy got into her four-door 2003 Toyota Corolla and drove toward the agreed location. She likely felt relieved. Getting the roughly $1,000 back meant she could finally stop worrying about the loan, put the entire situation behind her, and turn her attention back toward the plans she had for her own future. What Sandy didn't know was that the meeting had already been carefully planned. Alejandro wasn't waiting for her alone. Amia Abby Feaster was with him, and by that point she had become part of a plan that had moved far beyond angry conversations. Alejandro had also obtained a .45 caliber handgun. Investigators would later conclude that the weapon was part of what he intended to do that night. The two waited for Sandy with their escape already in mind. Even before she arrived, Alejandro and Abby appeared to be thinking about leaving Charlotte behind. When Sandy showed up, nothing immediately seemed dangerous. There was no sudden argument or obvious confrontation. Alejandro continued acting like the same person she knew from work, keeping everything calm long enough to make sure she didn't suspect anything. At some point, he persuaded Sandy to leave her own car and travel with him and Abby. The exact explanation isn't completely clear, but it may have involved going somewhere else to get the money he owed her. Whatever he said, Sandy trusted him. She stepped away from her 2003 Toyota Corolla and got into the vehicle with Alejandro and Abby. From there, they drove away from Charlotte and toward the more isolated areas of Cabarrus County. As the city faded behind them and the roads became darker, the atmosphere inside the vehicle must have changed. Alejandro seemed to know exactly where he was going. Eventually, he pulled into a secluded wooded area, far enough from busy roads and homes that there was little chance anyone would notice what was happening. Once they were there, the story about repaying Sandy disappeared. There was no cash and no peaceful way to settle the debt. Instead, investigators say Alejandro revealed the handgun he had brought with him. What happened during Sandy's final moments can only be reconstructed from evidence and later statements, but authorities determined that she suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head. It happened quickly, leaving Sandy almost no opportunity to escape or protect herself. A woman who had trusted Alejandro enough to lend him money had now paid an unimaginable price for that trust. Afterward, Alejandro and Abby focused on hiding what had happened. Sandy's body was moved into a shallow ravine and partially concealed beneath leaves and brush, apparently to delay its discovery. They also took control of Sandy's Toyota Corolla, along with her phone and personal belongings. Rather than simply abandoning everything at the scene, Alejandro and Abby began creating distance between themselves and the wooded area. They moved Sandy's car to another location, making it harder for investigators to immediately understand what had happened. The hours after Sandy's death showed how much planning had gone into the escape. Alejandro and Abby weren't simply reacting in panic. They were trying to create the appearance of a disappearance while giving themselves time to leave. Then they headed south. By the morning of August 10th, Sandy's family knew something was seriously wrong. She hadn't come home, and she wasn't answering her phone. That was completely out of character. Sandy was dependable, stayed in contact with her family, and wasn't someone who would simply disappear. Her mother and siblings began desperately trying to locate her. Hospitals were checked, calls were made, and soon a missing person report was filed. But while Sandy's family searched for answers, Alejandro and Abby were already moving farther away. To me, that is one of the most disturbing parts of this case. Alejandro had taken the trust built through months of working alongside Sandy and used it against her. A friendship that began inside an ordinary restaurant became the very thing that allowed him to lure her somewhere isolated. And all of it centered around a debt of roughly $1,000 and Alejandro's refusal to face responsibility for it. While Sandy's family searched desperately for her, the wooded area in Cabarrus County still held the answer, and the man investigators believed responsible was already heading toward the Mexican border. Sandy Lee's death was ultimately the result of a man refusing to face the consequences of his own choices. Instead of dealing with the debt and taking responsibility for his situation, Alejandro chose the most destructive way out. By the end of August 10th, the investigation was only beginning, but the damage had already been done. Sandy was gone, her family was desperate for answers, and Alejandro Castillo and Abby Feaster were already putting hundreds of miles between themselves and Charlotte. Alejandro had betrayed someone who trusted him completely. That decision would eventually turn him from an ordinary young restaurant worker into one of the FBI's most heavily pursued fugitives. The wooded area had gone quiet again, but what happened there would eventually connect investigators across two countries and fuel a search lasting nearly a decade. What Alejandro did also revealed something important about the man authorities were now dealing with. He wasn't some brilliant criminal strategist. He was someone who believed that intimidation and violence could erase the problems he had created for himself. As he traveled toward the border, he may have believed the hardest part was already behind him. What he didn't understand was that Sandy's death would ensure investigators never stopped looking for him. Back in North Carolina, the truth was still hidden among the trees, but Sandy's family had already begun searching, unwilling to accept that she had simply disappeared without explanation. When Wednesday morning, August 10th, arrived, the Lee home felt completely different from normal. Sandy was extremely dependable. She rarely broke her routine, never missed work without explanation, and always kept her mother and siblings informed if she planned to stay away from home. So when nobody could reach her that morning, concern quickly became panic. By around 8 a.m., repeated calls were going straight to voicemail. For her family, every unanswered attempt only made the situation feel more serious. They immediately began contacting friends, coworkers, and anyone who might have spoken with Sandy the previous evening. Alejandro Castillo's name came up almost immediately because people knew Sandy had planned to meet him regarding the money he owed her. When attempts were made to contact Alejandro and Abby, their explanations offered little reassurance. According to accounts of the investigation, they claimed either that Sandy hadn't shown up or that the meeting had been brief and she had left afterward. At first, those claims created uncertainty. Sandy's family had no way of knowing exactly what had happened, and valuable hours passed while they tried to piece together her movements. Later that day, the family officially reported Sandy missing to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Like many adult missing person cases, investigators initially had to consider several possibilities. Adults can leave voluntarily, change their plans, or temporarily cut off communication. But Sandy's family strongly rejected the idea that she had simply walked away. They knew her habits and personality, and her 2003 Toyota Corolla was missing too. The family quickly turned to social media and local news, circulating Sandy's photograph and asking anyone with information to contact authorities. As word spread, friends, co-workers, and members of the community joined the effort to find her. But with each passing day, the situation looked more troubling. Then, on Saturday, August 13th, the investigation suddenly stretched more than 2,000 miles across the country. A 2003 Toyota Corolla matching Sandy's vehicle was located in a parking area near the airport in Phoenix, Arizona. The car was abandoned and locked, and there was no sign of Sandy nearby. For investigators and Sandy's family, the discovery was deeply alarming. Charlotte and Phoenix were separated by thousands of miles, making it increasingly difficult to believe Sandy had simply driven away without contacting anyone. Instead, the abandoned car suggested that someone had intentionally moved it across several states. While forensic specialists examined the Corolla in Arizona, detectives in North Carolina began looking much more closely at Alejandro and Abby. They soon discovered that both had disappeared around the same time as Sandy. Their phones were no longer providing useful contact, their online activity had stopped, and they were no longer where investigators expected to find them. The timing was impossible to ignore. What had started as a missing person investigation was quickly turning into a search for two people who appeared to have deliberately fled Charlotte. But one question mattered more than anything else. Where was Sandy? On August 17, 2016, investigators finally received an answer. And for Sandy's family, it destroyed the last hope that she might still come home. Acting on new tips, search teams returned to the wooded parts of Cabarrus County near Midland. By then, they were no longer expecting to find Sandy alive. Instead, they searched the thick summer brush for anything disturbed or out of place. Eventually, they found what they had feared. The remains belonged to Sandy. The missing person case immediately became a homicide investigation. The medical examiner later confirmed that Sandy had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. There appeared to be little evidence of a prolonged struggle, suggesting she may not have understood what was happening until it was too late. The fact that she had been left in the woods while the people investigators believed responsible used her vehicle to escape deeply disturbed the Charlotte community. The search for Sandy was over. Now the search for Alejandro and Abby began in full force. Once Sandy's body was found, the FBI became more heavily involved. By then, Alejandro and Abby had already gained almost a week of distance. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from Phoenix and learned that the couple had reached the airport area, but there was no evidence they had boarded a flight. Authorities believed the airport was simply part of an attempt to confuse the trail. Additional footage showed Alejandro and Abby crossing into Mexico through the Nogales port of entry only 2 days after Sandy's death. For Sandy's family, the hope of finding her alive was replaced by a painful wait for justice. They had to bury a daughter and sister while knowing the main suspects were already somewhere across an international border. Charlotte rallied around the Lee family. Vigils were held, money was raised, and people who had never met Sandy came together to support them. But nothing could fill the space she left behind. As investigators reconstructed the escape, they began to see how much time Alejandro had managed to buy. Moving Sandy's Corolla to Arizona, delaying the discovery of her body, and immediately heading south had allowed him to create thousands of miles of separation before police fully understood what had happened. He had used those crucial early days to disappear into Mexico. The case was no longer just a Charlotte investigation. It had become an international manhunt, led in part by the FBI's Charlotte field office. Finding Alejandro would be far more complicated than tracking someone hiding in another American city. He had crossed into a country where he apparently had personal connections and enough familiarity with the region to avoid drawing attention. For many of the officers involved, the case became impossible to forget. Some had spent days hoping Sandy would be found safely, only to end up in a wooded ravine, confronting what had happened over a debt of roughly $1,000. The case also hit Charlotte hard because of how ordinary everything had looked before. These were co-workers who shared shifts, meals, jokes, and everyday conversations. Behind that normal appearance, however, investigators believed something much darker had been developing. Sandy's search had ended tragically, but the determination to find Alejandro only grew stronger. Federal authorities began taking the steps that would eventually place him among the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. They also knew the case would depend heavily on public tips and cooperation with Mexican authorities. As the summer of 2016 turned to fall, Alejandro's photograph began appearing in police departments, government notices, and online wanted posters. The 20-year-old restaurant worker had become the center of a manhunt that would continue for years. Sandy had been found. Now investigators wanted the man they believed had left her in those woods. The change from a local homicide case to an international fugitive investigation happened quickly. Once Sandy's remains were recovered, Charlotte Mecklenburg detectives understood they were dealing with something much larger. Their main suspect had already crossed an international border before investigators even knew the full scope of the crime. On October 24, 2016, a federal arrest warrant was issued for Alejandro Rosales Castillo for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. That warrant formally brought federal resources into the search. But by 2017, the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Detectives had Sandy's Corolla in Phoenix and surveillance images showing Alejandro and Abby near the border. What they didn't have was Alejandro. Once he entered Mexico, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. Investigators believed Alejandro had family connections in Guanajuato and enough familiarity with Mexico to blend in and disappear without attracting much attention. Because investigators considered Castillo especially dangerous and calculated, the FBI took the unusual step of placing him on its 10 most wanted fugitives list on October 24, 2017. He became the 516th person added to that list, with a reward of up to $100,000 offered for information leading to his arrest. That designation completely changed the scale of the investigation. This was no longer just a local search centered in Charlotte. Castillo's face and identifying features were now being circulated widely across the United States and Mexico. Wanted posters showed his dark hair, slim build, and the small mole beneath his left eye. At the same time, the FBI began working closely with its legal attaché office in Mexico City and with Mexican federal authorities to narrow down where he might be hiding. Investigators believe Castillo was probably using a false name and blending into everyday life. They suspected he might be working in construction, restaurants, or another type of job that would allow him to stay unnoticed in central Mexico. For Sandy's family, those years became emotionally exhausting. Every new FBI update or television segment about the case brought another burst of hope, followed by disappointment when the latest lead went nowhere. Then the years started passing one after another, 2018, 2019, 2020. Sandy's family had to live with the knowledge that she was gone while the man accused of taking her life was still somewhere out there, possibly living under another identity. The possibility that he might never face a courtroom became one of their greatest fears. Still, the investigation never truly stopped. Behind the scenes, agents continued working every possible lead. They looked into social media activity connected to people in Castillo's circle, interviewed distant relatives, and followed reports that he had been seen at gatherings in Mexico. Other tips placed him near bus terminals, border communities, and different cities throughout the country. Some leads triggered searches in places like Guanajuato and San Luis Potosí, only for agents to arrive and find that the person they were looking for had already disappeared. The manhunt became a long series of false starts and near misses. Investigators had to work across different languages, jurisdictions, and legal systems, which made every step more complicated. As the 5th year passed, and then the 8th, Castillo was no longer the 20-year-old restaurant employee shown in the original wanted photo. He was now approaching 30, and investigators knew time could have changed his appearance significantly. The FBI released age-progressed images showing how Castillo might look years later. They also focused on personal details, including his interest in soccer and certain music, hoping that something ordinary about his habits might eventually expose him. In the end, the breakthrough didn't come from some dramatic technological discovery. It came from years of pressure, cooperation between American and Mexican authorities, and investigators refusing to let the case fade away. The reward remained active, and the FBI's Charlotte field office stayed in regular contact with Mexican agencies. They were waiting for Castillo to make one mistake, contact the wrong person, or simply become comfortable enough to lower his guard. That moment finally arrived in early 2026. New intelligence began pointing toward Aguascalientes, a busy city in central Mexico known for its industry and historic neighborhoods. Investigators received information that a man resembling Castillo was living there quietly under a carefully constructed false identity. The FBI and Mexico's Attorney General's office, the FGR, began closely watching the suspect. After years of failed leads, they needed to be absolutely certain before making another move. Agents studied his routine, his movements, and the people around him. Little by little, they worked to confirm that the man they were watching was really Alejandro Rosales Castillo. Then, on the morning of January 16, 2026, the nearly 10-year search finally reached its turning point. In a coordinated operation involving Mexican federal authorities and the FBI, the fugitive who had managed to stay hidden for almost a decade was finally surrounded. There was no dramatic chase through the streets of Aguascalientes, and no violent confrontation. Law enforcement moved in quickly, leaving Castillo with little doubt that nearly 10 years of hiding had finally ended. When agents confronted him, they didn't use the false identity he had allegedly been living under. They called him by the name he had spent years trying to escape, Alejandro Rosales Castillo. News of the arrest traveled quickly back to Charlotte. For almost a decade, Sandy Lee's case had remained a painful reminder that some families can wait years for justice. When Sandy's relatives learned what had happened that Friday morning, there was no celebration. What they felt was relief after carrying the same unanswered questions for nearly 10 years. The search was finally over, and Castillo was in custody. For Sandy's family, that meant they could finally see the case move toward a courtroom. The investigation then entered another complicated stage, bringing Castillo back to the United States. Extradition required careful legal coordination between American and Mexican authorities. After spending nearly a decade searching for him, investigators were determined not to let a procedural mistake interfere with his return. Every legal step had to be handled correctly. As Castillo remained in Mexican custody, the situation had completely reversed. The border that once helped him disappear was now part of the process that would bring him back to answer for Sandy's death. The case showed that a person can travel thousands of miles and hide for years, but that doesn't mean investigators or a victim's family will stop looking. By the summer of 2026, Castillo's case had again become the focus of attention in Charlotte. A community that had remembered Sandy for nearly 10 years was now watching the legal process unfold. Prosecutors presented a detailed timeline using evidence from the wooded area in Cabarrus County, the Toyota Corolla recovered in Phoenix, and the movements investigators reconstructed after Sandy disappeared. At the center of the case was a motive that seemed almost impossible to understand because of how small it was. Prosecutors argued that everything grew from Castillo's refusal to repay roughly $1,000 to a woman who had originally given him the money because she wanted to help. Some of the most emotional testimony came from Sandy's family. Her mother and siblings described how deeply her absence had changed their lives over the previous decade. Throughout the proceedings, Castillo reportedly remained quiet and controlled. For Sandy's family, simply seeing him in a courtroom meant the end of years spent wondering whether he would ever be found. When the jury returned guilty verdicts, the courtroom remained remarkably quiet. After so much time, the moment carried more weight than any dramatic reaction could have expressed. The sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole brought a final legal answer to a case that had remained unresolved for years. Castillo had spent nearly a decade trying to escape the consequences of a decision that began with an unpaid debt. In the end, the cost was far greater than the money he had refused to repay. The Alejandro Rosales Castillo case is a reminder that even a long fugitive search can eventually end. Borders, false identities, and years of silence can slow an investigation, but they don't always stop it. For nearly 10 years, Castillo lived knowing that one mistake could expose him. Meanwhile, Sandy's family continued making sure her name was never forgotten. Their persistence, along with years of cooperation between investigators in both countries, kept the case alive even when the trail appeared cold. Today, Castillo's wanted poster no longer represents an unfinished search. Sandy's family has finally reached the point they waited years to see, and Sandy Lee's story should never be reduced to the money Alejandro owed her. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and someone whose kindness was taken advantage of by a person she trusted. After nearly 10 years, the hunt is finally over. If you stayed with me until the end, you're definitely a true fan of these cases. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like so you don't miss the next story.